When a black female entrepreneur's tech company secured a $250 million government contract, she came an invitation to a nationally televised talk show promising a fair discussion. But from the moment she stepped into the studio, she saw the trap. They tried to undermine her on live television, bombarding her with loaded questions, attempting to shake her credibility. But she wasn't someone they could break easily. She had faced bigger battles before, and she wasn't about to let them rewrite her success story. Before we dive in, tell us where you're from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The email arrived in the late afternoon, crisp and formal, bearing the unmistakable efficiency of a network producer. It was from WBC Network, the team behind Morning Focus, one of the most watched talk shows in the country. The invitation was clear. They wanted Imani Cole, CEO of Omnitech, to be a guest on an upcoming segment about diversity in business. Imani had seen this before. The mainstream media's sudden interest in black entrepreneurs always came in waves, usually when it served their narrative. A feel-good segment here, a roundtable discussion there, just enough to feign progress before shifting back to business as usual. But this wasn't some upstart company they were calling in. Omnitech had just secured a $250 million government contract, outbidding some of the most powerful tech firms in the industry. That wasn't luck. That was 15 years of relentless work, of coding through the night, of meetings where she was the only black woman in the room, of fighting for respect in an industry that never made space for people like her. Still, she hesitated before responding. Something felt off. Her assistant, Jordan Ellis, noticed. "You sure you want to do this?" His voice held the edge of someone who had seen too many setups disguised as opportunities. "You know how these shows work. They love a success story, but they love tearing one down even more." Imani exhaled, leaning back in her chair, eyes fixed on the city skyline beyond her office windows. "I know," she murmured, half to herself. "But it's national exposure. Let's see what they have to say." Jordan didn't look convinced. "Just don't let them bait you," he warned. She nodded, but deep down, she already understood the game. If this was a trap, they were playing chess with the wrong woman. The morning of the interview, Imani arrived at WBC Studios in New York, dressed in a navy blue suit that radiated control. The moment she stepped inside, the air changed. The green room was sterile and impersonal, the kind of place where guests were cycled in and out like transactions. A young producer greeted her without looking up from her clipboard. "Miss Cole, thanks for being here. We'll mic you up in 5. No small talk, no warm-up, just straight to business." She was used to it. As she sat in the makeup chair, an assistant powdered her face with indifference, barely acknowledging her presence beyond the bare minimum. On the monitor in front of her, the live broadcast of Morning Focus played, showing a panel discussion on celebrity scandals, followed by a segment on the latest fitness trends. Then, a transition card flashed across the screen. "Coming UP next, the Black Tech Boom, ISIT Talent or Special Treatment." Imani's jaw tightened. So that was the angle. They weren't here to talk about her work, her innovation, or how Omnitech had outperformed industry giants to win that contract. No, they were setting up the narrative. Was she talented, or was she a product of government handouts? She should have expected it. But if they thought they had the upper hand, they were in for a rude awakening. The set of Morning Focus was designed to look inviting, with its soft blues and golds, the curved white couches arranged in a way that suggested intimacy and warmth. A glass coffee table sat between the host's chair and the guests, a sleek, modern touch meant to give the illusion of transparency. But Imani knew better. Nothing about this was transparent. The cameras hovered like silent predators, capturing every movement, every micro-expression, ready to dissect and broadcast them to millions. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer as she took her seat, posture straight but relaxed, a picture of quiet power. Across from her, Ethan Pierce, the show's lead anchor, was already in position. He was a seasoned journalist, known for his sharp interviews, his ability to steer a conversation exactly where he wanted it to go. He had built a reputation on being tough but fair, though in reality his approach often depended on who was sitting across from him. His smile was practiced, the kind that barely touched his eyes. "Imani Cole," he began, his voice smooth, effortless, made for television. CEO of Omnitech. A true American success story. Imani gave a polite nod. I appreciate the invitation. Ethan flipped through his cue cards, a calculated gesture that made it seem like he was just casually reviewing his notes, but Imani knew he had every word planned. Let's get right into it, he said, leaning forward just slightly, as if this was a friendly conversation, rather than a televised interrogation. Your company recently secured a $250 million government contract, beating out some of the biggest names in tech. That's impressive. Imani didn't flinch. She had seen this tactic before. Build her up first. Make it seem like they respected her accomplishments. Then, once the audience was on board, tear her down. She kept her response measured. It was a competitive process. We developed a security encryption system that outperformed our competitors. Simple as that. Ethan nodded, as if considering her words. Then, the pivot. Some have called it groundbreaking, he said, and then, the pause. A momentary hesitation, just enough to plant doubt before he continued. But others have raised questions. Imani remained perfectly still. She knew what was coming. Ethan picked up one of his cards, glancing at it before looking back at her. Some industry experts say Omnitech benefited from certain federal diversity incentives. That companies like yours have an edge in these contracts because agencies are actively looking to diversify their vendors. That perhaps he tilted his head slightly, voice even. This wasn't just about being the best, but about meeting a quota. There it was. Imani let a beat pass before she responded, not out of hesitation, but to make sure her next words landed. I've heard that argument before, she said, voice calm but firm. It's funny, though when a black entrepreneur wins, people suddenly start talking about special treatment. But when a legacy firm run by the same families for generations lands those same contracts, nobody questions it. The air in the studio shifted. It wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was noticeable. The producers off camera glanced at each other, the tension palpable. Ethan, to his credit, held his ground. So, you're saying race played no role at all in your success? Imani chuckled softly, shaking her head. Let me ask you something, Ethan. When SpaceX won its NASA contracts, was it because Elon Musk met a diversity quota? When Jeff Bezos landed government deals for Blue Origin, was it because of his background? Or do we only ask that question when the CEO looks like me? Ethan's expression barely flickered, but she saw at the briefest hesitation, the second where he realized she wasn't going to play along. Still, he pressed on. So you don't believe these diversity programs help? Imani folded her hands together, her tone unwavering. They help level the playing field. But what people don't realize is she leaned forward just slightly. The playing field was never level to begin with. A noticeable pause. The control room must have been scrambling. The producers in the wings were locked in now, watching this unfold in real time. But Ethan wasn't done. He had one more move before the commercial break, one more push before the real fireworks started. He smiled, slow, deliberate, the kind of smile that said he was leading her somewhere she wouldn't like. Then he glanced down at his cue cards again and back up at her. Well, Imani, he said smoothly, since we're talking about the playing field, you mentioned building your company from the ground up. You grew up in Detroit, single mother, public school, worked your way through college. That's inspiring. Imani gave a slow nod, knowing exactly where this was going. But here's what some might wonder, Ethan continued, his tone shifting, still polished, still professional, but colder now, sharper. How does someone with no Ivy League background, no deep family connections, no venture capital backing go from a struggling neighborhood to securing contracts that billion-dollar corporations fail to land? There it was. Not just questioning her success, but implying that it was unnatural, impossible, that someone must have pulled the strings for her. He let the question hang, letting the audience sit with the implication. Imani tilted her head slightly, as if considering her words carefully. Then she smiled. But it wasn't warm. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that came right before the checkmate. It's called work, Ethan, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. Some of us don't have generational wealth or country club networks to fall back on. So we build. From the ground up. Ethan gave a small nod, like he was hearing her but not listening. But surely, he pressed, you would help along the way. Maybe a mentor? A program? Something that gave you an extra push. Imani exhaled quietly. Help, she echoed, letting the word settle before she answered. Yeah, help came in the form of working 3 jobs while getting my engineering degree. Help came in the form of sleeping in my office while I built my first software prototype because I couldn't afford rent. Her lips curved slightly, just for a moment. That's the help I got. Ethan's expression remained neutral, but she caught at the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled just a little tighter around his cue cards. The producers were locked in now. They knew this wasn't just another interview. This was about to go viral. Ethan adjusted slightly in his seat, crossing one leg over the other, his fingers grazing the edge of his cue cards, as if deciding which weapon to draw next. Imani had seen it before, the subtle recalibration of a host who realized their original strategy wasn't working. He wasn't just trying to trip her up anymore. Now, he was looking for a way to control the damage, to regain dominance over the conversation. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Ethan smiled, the kind of well-rehearsed, camera-friendly expression that masked the shift in his approach. I understand where you're coming from, he said smoothly, leaning forward just enough to appear engaged but not so much that it seemed confrontational. But let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Some would argue that Black entrepreneurs today have more opportunities than ever before. That programs like affirmative action, minority business grants, government incentives, they all exist specifically to open doors that weren't open decades ago. He let the words settle, his tone carefully measured, walking the thin line between curiosity and accusation. Wouldn't you say that, in some ways, the system is working? Imani exhaled slowly, resting her forearms on her knees, not breaking eye contact. This was how they framed it every time, a gentle nudge toward the idea that, if she had succeeded, then the system must not be broken at all. You know what's funny, Ethan? She said, her voice even, controlled. When a Black business owner succeeds, people always ask what programs helped us. But nobody asks which old money bank funded a white-owned startup. Nobody asks which family connections got them into Stanford or which country club friend invested in their company. She tilted her head slightly. It's almost like we're not allowed to win without an asterisk. The energy in the room shifted again. The producers behind the cameras stopped moving, the studio crew still as statues. Ethan held his professional mask well, but the slight tightening around his mouth, the flicker of something behind his eyes, it was there. He nodded once, as if processing her words, then switched angles. I hear you, he said, keeping his voice level, but let's talk about public perception. You present yourself as a self-made success, which, again, is incredible, but some critics argue that the media plays a role in elevating certain stories over others. That Black entrepreneurs, especially those with a compelling against-the-odds narrative, get more attention than their white counterparts, who have worked just as hard but don't get the same headlines. Ah, there it was. Now Black success was a marketing strategy. Imani let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. Oh, so now we get too much attention, she said, her tone somewhere between amused and exhausted. In a world where 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men, where less than 2% of venture capital goes to Black founders, where tech funding still overwhelmingly flows to the same tight circles, she lifted an eyebrow. But the real issue is that people like me get too many headlines. Ethan adjusted in his seat again, but the shift was microscopic, almost imperceptible. He wasn't expecting her to laugh. He tucked a loose strand of hair behind his ear, regaining his rhythm. I'm just pointing out, he said smoothly, that in today's climate, some people feel there's pressure to highlight diversity over pure merit. Imani exhaled, rubbing her hands together for a brief moment before locking eyes with him again. Merit? Ha, she said, her voice quieter now but somehow heavier. She turned slightly, glancing toward the cameras, directly addressing the audience now. Let me ask you something, Ethan. She looked back at him. Do you really think that if I wasn't exceptional at what I do, I'd be sitting in this chair right now? His lips parted slightly, but before he could respond, she continued. You think I got here because I played the diversity card? She asked, her voice sharp now. Or do you think I got here despite everything designed to keep me out? The silence in the studio was louder than any of his previous questions. But Ethan wasn't finished. Not yet. He had one last card to play, the one designed to break her, to force her into either defensiveness or outrage. Either reaction would make for great television. He took a slow breath, shifting in his seat just enough to make it look casual, but Imani saw at the crack in the facade, the moment he decided to go for the kill. "Nimani," he said, his tone light, conversational, almost too easy, as if he was luring her into a false sense of security. "I think it's fair to say you're passionate about this, and I respect that." He paused, just for a beat. "But let me ask you something." Imani gave a slight nod, waiting. "Do you think some of this outrage is exaggerated?" The audacity. Ethan leaned in slightly, his expression perfectly neutral, carefully crafted. "After all," he continued, "your success story proves that the system isn't as stacked against black entrepreneurs as some claim." Imani felt a heat rising in her spine, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You know," she said, voice measured, controlled, "it's funny how people love to use one success story as proof that a problem doesn't exist." Ethan stayed silent, listening but not necessarily hearing. Imani leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on her knees, speaking directly now. "Let me put it this way," she said. "If one person climbs out of a burning building, do you point at them and say, 'See, the fire wasn't that bad'?" Ethan opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it. Imani wasn't done. "The fact that I made it doesn't mean the system isn't broken," she said, her voice steady. "It just means I fought twice as hard to get through it." The studio was silent. Even the producers had stopped moving. The kind of silence that doesn't just exist, it lingers. Ethan adjusted, trying to find a response, but Imani saw it now. She had already won. Ethan shifted in his chair again, the silence between them thick, stretching longer than any broadcast producer would be comfortable with. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had walked her down a carefully constructed path, set up the questions in a way that should have forced her into either anger or defensiveness, either of which would have made for great television. But instead, she had turned his own argument inside out and placed it in his lap, making him sit with it, making everyone watching sit with it. He couldn't let the silence linger any longer. That was dangerous. That let the moment belong to her. So he recalibrated. He picked up his cue card, turned it over as if he was considering his next words carefully, though he already knew what they were. Then, with a practiced sigh, one that suggested he was about to say something that was more difficult but somehow more honest, he tilted his head slightly, as if offering her a moment of goodwill before delivering his final attack. "Well, Imani," he said, his voice even, almost gentle, "since we're talking about systems and fairness, let's talk about another factor: accountability." The word landed like a warning shot. Ethan leaned back, setting his cue card down deliberately, signaling to the audience that what he was about to say wasn't scripted, that this was something more serious, more pressing. It was a classic tactic, one that created the illusion that he was now speaking from a place of genuine concern rather than strategy. Imani didn't move, but she felt her pulse shift slightly. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head just enough to show disappointment, as if what he was about to say was something he hated to bring up but felt morally obligated to. "There's been a lot of discussion about Omnitech's rise," he said, his tone quieter now, leaning into the gravity of the moment. "And with that kind of success, naturally comes scrutiny." Imani's fingers curled slightly on her lap, but she didn't speak. Ethan reached for a different stack of cue cards, one that had been tucked away separately from the rest. That alone was a signal. This was the part they hadn't warned her about. He picked up the top card, glancing at it briefly before meeting her eyes again. It was reported that Omnitech, in its early years, worked with Paragon Systems, a cybersecurity contractor that was later investigated for fraud and misuse of federal funds. His tone remained neutral, professional, but there was something coiled underneath, something waiting. "What do you say to those who believe that your company benefited from connections to a firm that, whether knowingly or unknowingly, engaged in unethical business practices?" There it was, the ambush. He had been waiting to use this, waiting for the right moment to undermine everything she had built, waiting for the perfect time to reframe her success as tainted, questionable, compromised. Imani exhaled slowly through her nose. She could already picture the headlines, the clickbait articles that would strip away context, the bad faith commentators who would pounce on this moment, as if it validated everything they wanted to believe about her. Black success always came with an asterisk, and if they couldn't find one, they'd create one. She turned slightly in her chair, her expression unreadable. She wasn't rushing. That was key. Paragon Systems was a vendor, she said finally, her voice steady. A subcontractor that Omnitech worked with briefly years before any investigation into their finances came to light. Ethan nodded, waiting, pressing her to say more. Imani gave him nothing. So you're saying, he continued, choosing his words with precision, you had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. Imani tilted her head slightly. Are you asking me, she said slowly, if my company had knowledge of something that happened years after our contract ended? Ethan's jaw tensed, just for a fraction of a second. He was good at this, but so was she. I'm asking, he clarified, if you believe that Omnitech's association with Paragon played any role in its ability to secure government contracts later on. Imani let the moment breathe. She knew the optics of this question. She also knew the truth. No, she said, firm but not defensive. Omnitech has won every single contract on the strength of our work, our security technology, and our results. The idea that a short-term vendor relationship from over a decade ago somehow negates everything my company has built. She shook her head slightly. That's a stretch, even for you, Ethan. A few muffled chuckles from the crew. The tension cracked, just a little. Ethan's lips pressed together. He had lost control of the moment. But Imani wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the space between them. Enough that it wasn't just an answer anymore, it was a shift in power. And let's be real, she continued. If we're suddenly interested in every single business connection a CEO has ever had, I have to wonder, she arched an eyebrow, where was this same energy when a certain former president built his real estate empire on fraudulent loans? Or when Fortune 500 companies keep landing billion-dollar government contracts despite violating labor laws? She tilted her head slightly. Or, she added, voice calm, do we only bring up these questions when the CEO looks like me? Ethan's mouth tensed, a flicker of something almost frustrated in his expression. He had walked into that one. The silence that followed was different this time. Not just discomfort, realization. Even some of the producers behind the cameras had shifted their weight, exchanging glances, sensing the moment had flipped. For the first time, Ethan was the one hesitating. And he knew it. He cleared his throat, his gaze flicking to the control room, likely hoping someone would cut to commercial, but no one did. This was too good for ratings. So he forced a small smile, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. We'll let the audience decide, he said smoothly. Imani exhaled lightly, the smallest amused smirk touching her lips. I think, she said, they already have. And with that, the balance of power had shifted. Not just in the room. Across the country. The moment the cameras cut, the tension didn't break. It thickened. The producers scrambled behind their monitors, hushed voices bouncing off the studio walls as crew members exchanged glances. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, his posture still controlled but his eyes betraying the frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had lost the moment, and he knew it. Imani sat still, unwavering, her presence commanding even in silence. She had walked onto this stage knowing the game, knowing how they'd try to trap her, and yet she had flipped the board. The interview wasn't over, but the battle was. A junior producer rushed toward Ethan, whispering something in his earpiece. He nodded once, his jaw tight, then turned back to Imani with the faintest trace of forced composure. That was quite the discussion, he said, his voice measured, trying to regain a sense of control. I appreciate your time today. Imani gave a polite nod, offering nothing extra, no performative handshake, no false warmth. Of course, she said, standing, smoothing her blazer with a quiet kind of victory. The moment she stepped off set, Jordan was already waiting for her, his phone screen lit up with notifications. His expression was unreadable, but she knew him well enough to catch the shift in his energy. "You need to see this," he muttered, walking her toward the green room, his voice a little too even. Imani followed, the sounds of the studio fading as she entered the more private space. He handed her the phone. The internet had already exploded. A clip from the interview the moment she had turned Ethan's question about black privilege back on him had already hit social media. But it wasn't just the usual media pundits analyzing it. It was everywhere. Trending topic 1. Imani Cole just checked the whole system. Trending topic 2. If one person escapes a burning building. Trending topic 3. Where was this energy for? Her words had become sound bites, her comebacks battle cries. There were tweets dissecting every moment, TikTok videos replaying her responses, Instagram posts with captions like "This is how you handle a setup and they tried it," and she flipped the script. But not all of it was good. She scrolled further, eyes scanning the growing backlash. The right-wing machine had mobilized. Predictable attacks had begun. Imani Cole plays the race card. A CEO or an activist. Just another angry black woman. Some tweets were outright venomous, others more calculated, weaving just enough plausible deniability into their rhetoric. Then came the real ones, the threats. Emails filled with veiled warnings, messages in her company's inbox reading "Watch your step." And then, one that stopped her for a moment. A screenshot of her home address, posted in a forum known for targeting public figures. Jordan must have seen the way her body stiffened, because his voice dropped quieter now. "We need security." Imani exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. "We knew this was coming." Jordan's jaw tightened. "That doesn't make it acceptable." She didn't respond. Instead, she walked toward the mirror on the far side of the room, adjusting her earrings, watching herself as she steadied her own reflection. This was what happened when a black woman didn't shrink. This was what happened when she didn't just succeed, but succeeded loudly, unapologetically, without asking for permission. They didn't mind her winning so long as she played by their rules. But she hadn't. Jordan sighed, running a hand over his head. "Look, you handled that interview like a damn masterclass. But now it's not just about the debate anymore. It's about what comes next." She turned to him. "And what comes next?" He hesitated, then pulled up another email. A new offer. Not from a corporation. Not from another tech firm. From a network. A primetime special. An hour-long, unfiltered conversation, her terms, her control. No pre-approved questions, no gotcha journalism. Just her, speaking. Jordan watched her carefully. "You're already the most talked about CEO in the country right now. The only question is, do you want to keep the conversation going?" Imani took the phone from his hand, scanning the details, her mind already working ahead, calculating, deciding. She could walk away now, let the noise die down, let the headlines move on. Or she could step into it. Not just as a CEO. Not just as a woman who had won a contract. But as someone who had something to say. She looked up at Jordan, her expression calm, resolved. "Tell them I'll do it," she said. Jordan exhaled, something between pride and knowing exhaustion crossing his face. "You sure?" Imani set the phone down, adjusting the cuff of her blazer. Her voice didn't waver. "Yeah," she said, "but on my terms." And just like that, the next move was hers. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.